Peter Thompson served as a private in the United States Army's 7th Cavalry Regiment during the American Indian Wars. He gained recognition for his first-hand narration of the Battle of Little Bighorn, often referred to as Custer's Last Stand, which occurred on June 25, 1876. Thompson was attached to Company C of the 7th Cavalry, which fell under the direct command of Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer. Amid the conflict, Thompson was cut off from his company and had to take cover in a gulch where he witnessed the combat and the downfall of Custer's detachment. Following the battle, he managed to survive and regrouped with the remaining elements of the 7th Cavalry. He eventually composed a thorough recollection of his experiences, offering historians significant information on the engagement. His story has come to be seen as one of the most credible and insightful first-hand reports concerning the Battle of Little Bighorn, and historians have often relied upon it in efforts to piece together the battle's events. But before we dive into it, make sure you like this video and subscribe to our channel to help grow this community. As morning broke, the troops mounted, and each company was aligned in single-file lines. Starting at the front, every soldier would shout and state his assigned number: 1, 2, 3, 4. And so the cycle continued until the company was completely divided into groups of 4. Cavalrymen typically dismounted to fight on foot unless a charge was commanded. Once an order to dismount was given, the 4th man in each group remained on horseback while the first 3 would dismount and pass their reins to him. This 4th man stayed behind to manage the horses while the others fanned out to fight, either as skirmishers or under other directives. My assigned group of 4 included Private John Fitzgerald, Private John Brennan, Private James Watson, and myself. Though we were among the sets sent into battle with Custer, none of us actually made it to the fatal ground where Custer and his men perished. Brennan and Fitzgerald veered their horses away toward the rear once we had traveled a couple of miles past a lone teepee. We climbed to the top of a ridge from which we could see the surrounding terrain. A group from Company F, who had been sent to examine the teepee, passed by us en route to the front, reporting that it housed a deceased native man and burial items intended for his afterlife journey. Riding another half-mile, we reached a point where the native encampment came into view. The sight was extraordinary, especially to someone unfamiliar with such a spectacle. For nearly 3 miles along the river's left bank, rows of white teepees stood out under the sun. Past the settlement, a dark spread of ponies grazed on the short green plains. As the troops caught sight of the village, they let out a classic battle cry and urged their mounts into a gallop. Around this moment, 5 men from Company F were dispatched to scout ahead, and from that point on, despite all my efforts, I began falling behind my unit. Others, too, found themselves in the same situation. No amount of coaxing could push my horse forward. Frustrated, I dismounted and attempted to properly secure my spurs. Just then, I heard my name being called, and looking up, I saw Brennan approaching on horseback. "What's going on?" he asked. I responded that my horse appeared completely exhausted. "Let's stick together," he offered. Straightening up, I said, "I'll tell you what, how about we swap horses?" He shot me a strange glance, turned his horse around, and headed off in the opposite direction, leaving me to fend for myself. I resolved to keep moving regardless. Once I'd reattached my spurs, I climbed back into the saddle and pressed on, though my horse moved slowly. When my spurs came loose again, I noticed a pair lying in the path, so I got down to retrieve them. A curse behind me caught my attention. I turned to see Watson struggling to get his fallen horse on its feet. The poor beast had collapsed and was having a hard time rising. Nearby sat Sergeant Finkel on his mount, calmly observing but doing nothing to help. Eventually, the horse stood up with a groan, and Finkel sped off to rejoin our company. By that time, the last of the companies had gone over the ridge. Still preoccupied with my spurs, I was crouched down when Watson walked up and asked what the issue was, then went on, following the others. I remounted, but found my horse could barely manage a stumbling walk. Looking across the river, I noticed the native village was in upheaval. Groups of warriors were riding down the river, while others surged toward the village's upper section. The cause of the chaos was Major Reno's approach. He and 3 companies were charging forward, just a mile from the upper edge of the village. Officers led slightly ahead of their men. It was an awe-inspiring scene. Cavalry charging boldly at an enemy who greatly outnumbered them. Their horses remained tightly controlled. There was no scattering. They advanced shoulder to shoulder, tails whipping in the wind, weapons glinting under the sun. The spectacle explained the flurry of activity within the village. Still, appearances can be deceiving. The cavalry charged in, and a non-commissioned officer halted to plant the unit's guidon beside a teepee before being shot off his mount. The pause was brief. The native forces stormed toward them in force. At this point, a blaze broke out in the dry grass, threatening the entire village. The women, as fearless as their warriors, battled the flames and tore down the burning teepees. Recognizing he was vastly outnumbered, Major Reno ordered a swift retreat to a nearby cottonwood grove about a mile downstream, where the troops and horses could find shelter. Meanwhile, I trudged along on foot, leading my weakened horse, fearful that he would collapse beneath me. With Custer and his men out of sight, I felt exposed, stranded deep in hostile territory, leading a useless animal. Lost in thought over my grim situation, I spotted Watson ahead of me, but even at his slow pace, I couldn't catch up. He suddenly veered off the trail, likely reacting to some unseen threat. I then noticed a group of about 30 native warriors herding ponies and mules coming in our direction. I feared my time had come. Escape wasn't an option. I weighed my chances on foot versus staying with my horse, when something familiar about the group's appearance struck me. As they approached, I realized they were our own scouts, accompanied by 2 Crow warriors. One of them, Half Yellow Face, also called Two Bloody Hands, was so named for the red or ink-colored handprints on the back of his buckskin shirt. I explained my plight and requested a mount swap. Half Yellow Face just shook his head and repeated, heap Sioux, heap shoot, come," motioning for me to turn back with them. I declined, and while they returned to the rear, I moved forward. The mounts they rode had been taken from the Sioux. Watson was no longer in sight, so I mounted my horse again, hoping I might get better speed. Soon after, I realized I wasn't alone. As I neared the top of the hill, I saw 5 Sioux warriors. We spotted each other simultaneously. 2 of them lifted their rifles and aimed at me. I instinctively raised my carbine, but it was unloaded. I had a habit of keeping it empty while riding, so we all stood there, weapons trained on one another. They didn't shoot, and neither could I. Though my revolver was loaded, I wasn't reckless enough to challenge 5 opponents alone. After a tense standoff, the warriors dismounted and crept after the other 3. I surveyed my surroundings, seeking an escape route. Fighting 5 was out of the question, and more warriors had taken up positions along the trail ahead. Climbing down the bluff was nearly impossible. They were scaling up from below. To my right lay a gully, and at its bottom some wild cherry shrubs. Beyond that, atop a higher ledge, stood a stone pillar, which I hoped might serve as a defensive perch. I knew quick action was vital, so I dismounted and dashed into the ravine. A flock of birds burst from the bushes, startling me enough to change course. I made for the rocky pillar. Once there, I assessed my ammo. My pistol had 5 rounds, and my belt carried 17 carbine cartridges, not much to rely on. I'd left a large supply in my saddlebags, but my prairie belt couldn't carry more. Ammo belts were a recent development, and many of us only had small boxes for ammunition when away from our horses. The pillar itself disappointed me. It was just 18 inches thick and stood 7 feet tall, topped with decayed cottonwood, likely constructed by natives for unknown reasons. I took stock, then sat down to consider my odds of survival. If the cavalry drove the enemy from their camp, warriors would scatter, and if any stumbled upon me, I'd likely meet a grim end. I glanced back to where I had left my horse. He was still there, being circled by a mounted warrior. I thought it a shame that the ammo I'd left behind might fall into enemy hands. Realizing it was time to move again, I resolved to reach the point where the trail curved toward the river. I started off at a brisk pace and soon arrived at the bend. Here, the trail sloped down toward the river, heavily eroded on both sides. I turned to see a mounted warrior sprinting toward me. The trail led to the river, then into the village. The earlier chaos had faded. The village looked deserted, eerily quiet. But peering closer, I saw scattered figures creeping about, and occasionally one would dart across an open area in haste. Then I spotted something unexpected. At the hill's base, a white man rode casually along. Suddenly, he turned and followed the river. Hoping for company, I almost called out, but luckily I held my tongue, for I saw where Watson, for it was he, was headed. He was unknowingly approaching a group of warriors gathered near the riverbank, talking animatedly. Though the weather was scorching, they were wrapped in blankets, some marked with the letters ID for Indian Department. It was clear they were hostiles. Watson hadn't noticed. Desperate to warn him, I sprinted downhill and stumbled into a deep ravine I couldn't avoid. I landed far below, somehow keeping my balance. The soft earth cushioned my fall. Once close enough, I called softly to Watson. He paused and looked around. I rushed up and asked where he was headed. To our scouts, of course, he replied. I told him he'd passed them earlier on the trail. Then who are those men up ahead? He asked. I told him I believed they were enemies, and we ought to steer clear. He agreed. We debated our next move. Eventually, we decided to try entering the village via the trail. I said, Watson, I'll need to hang onto your horse's tail so I can keep up. We set out as planned. Not long after, we witnessed something odd. From the river emerged one of our Crow scouts, horseback, dragging a Sioux woman with a rope looped around her wrists. She resisted fiercely. Then General Custer appeared, riding swiftly from the river crossing. He spoke briefly with the Crow, fluent as he was in several native tongues. Their exchange ended quickly, and the woman was freed. She bolted in our direction, crouched low, clutching a long knife. Her ferocity made me reach for my pistol. She noticed and veered away, crossing the river and vanishing into the village. The Crow trotted off. Custer, riding his sorrel horse, wore only his shirt sleeves due to the heat. His buckskin pants were tucked into his boots, his buckskin shirt strapped behind his saddle. A wide-brimmed cream hat, tilted upward on one side by a hook, adorned his head, ideal for aiming his rifle, which lay across his lap. He leaned forward in his seat as he rode. That was how he looked just 30 minutes before his final battle. After speaking to the Crow, he turned back to the crossing. Passing by us, he briefly slowed, waved twice for us to follow, pointed downstream, spurred his horse, and vanished without a word. That was the last time I saw Custer alive. He must have headed straight for his men. We wondered why none of his aides were with him. Perhaps he had outpaced them. His solo presence underscored his fearlessness, even in enemy territory. We reached the crossing as quickly as we could, but no trace of him remained. Whether he moved through the village or followed the stream remains unknown. Since we hadn't seen him cross, we assumed he traveled downstream. The river surged rapidly, both banks splashed from constant crossings. We paused to decide how best to proceed. In the village, the guidon fluttered, placed there by the corporal just before being shot. That glimpse emboldened us. Watson agreed to test the river depth by crossing first. I, parched, stooped to drink. As I did, and just as Watson reached midstream, 3 gunshots rang out. I jumped upright. On the opposite shore, where we had intended to go, stood 3 warriors, rifles still smoking. "What in thunder's going on?" Watson shouted. "If you don't get off that horse now, you'll be shot," I replied. He obeyed instantly, leaping off like a frog, limbs splashing. 2 warriors vanished into the village, likely thinking he was dead. The third, decorated in war paint and feathers, probably a chief, remained. Watson crawled ashore. If he'd been thirsty before, I'm sure he wasn't anymore. I resolved to climb the bank and return fire. I told Watson to keep still, then cautiously backed up, watching the warrior. He aimed and fired, but the bullet sank into the clay beside me. The wet slope made climbing difficult. He fired again with the same result. Now I was angry. I clambered up, no longer caring about form. Still he aimed. I waited for his shot, then dropped sideways. The bullet zipped past, hitting the bluff behind me. Now it was my turn. I loaded my carbine quickly and aimed as he turned toward his horse, winding his rope. My shot missed. Watson had moved, throwing off my aim. Trying to eject the shell, I found it stuck. Desperate, I clawed at it and finally used my thumbnail to dislodge it. The cartridge was filthy, not ideal in such moments. I carefully inserted a clean one and, after instructing Watson to stay down, took aim again. This time, as the warrior neared his pony, I fired. The bullet passed through him and hit the ground beneath the horse, scattering dirt. He flung up his hands and collapsed between his mount's legs. Taking a life is never easy, but he had tried to take mine, and survival is nature's foremost law. As I fired, Watson scrambled from the river and approached, leading his mount. I asked if his horse could go on. "No," he said. "Then leave it," I advised. "We'll need all our strength just for ourselves." He hesitated, then abandoned his mount, gear and all, just as I had. We discussed what to do next. The village was still under native control. It would be foolish to enter again. Going downstream was out of the question, so we decided to follow the river's right bank, hoping to spot Custer's men and rejoin them where help was needed. Watson cast one last look at his horse, then we began our dangerous trek. Plenty of warriors appeared along our side of the river. They grew more numerous and daring, though they kept their distance. We stayed close to the underbrush along the riverbank. Suddenly, a small group approached at a jog, forcing us into hiding. Once they passed, we continued, only to duck again as another group neared. Likely they were heading into the village via the ford. We decided to find a concealed spot to escape the brutal sun and wait for the situation to calm. The warriors were swarming now, far from the surprise they'd shown when the 7th Cavalry first arrived. Clearly, it had been a surprise attack, but now they were regrouping. After pushing Major Reno back across the river, the village began to stir with activity. The herd of ponies that had grazed at a distance were now corralled near the teepees, making mounts readily available. Riders sped back and forth, kicking up dust that mixed with smoke from the burning brush and grass. The women had managed to subdue the flames, keeping the fire restricted to a relatively small area. We found a place to hide in a loop of the river shaped like an S, giving us flowing water on 3 sides. Tucked inside a cluster of redberry bushes, we discovered a fallen log that served as a rather decent bench. Peering through the dense foliage, I thought I spotted the horse Billy Jackson, our guide, had been riding. One of its hind legs had been badly torn by a bullet. I pointed it out to Watson, but he wasn't convinced it was the same animal. Watson had crossed paths with Jackson earlier while traveling the ridge, not far from the turn leading to the village. According to him, Jackson had been in a state of panic. When asked what was wrong, Jackson blurted out, "Have you seen Custer?" Surprised, Watson said no, and asked again what was going on. Jackson then claimed that Custer had fired at him, severing the stirrup strap on his saddle. To escape with his life, he had taken off at a gallop. Watson noticed the strap had indeed been shot through, and Jackson, missing his hat, appeared wild and frantic. Jackson kept glancing around, clearly terrified. Without warning, he spurred his horse and galloped off, his hair flying, looking in every direction like he expected someone to emerge. What baffled Watson the most was that instead of doubling back, Jackson veered off across the plains, riding as hard as his pony could go. I asked Watson if this incident might explain why Custer had left his troops. He simply shook his head, uncertain. We had barely been hidden for 10 minutes when a sudden burst of gunfire rang out downstream, followed by erratic shooting. Carefully parting the bushes with my rifle, avoiding the sharp thorns that tore at my clothes and skin, I got a view of the scene. Custer's forces were formed in a curved battle line, 2 ranks deep, facing off against Indians crossing the river at both flanks. The Indians fought on horseback while the cavalry had dismounted. The soldiers' horses were kept behind the formation. The cavalry was clearly outnumbered and disadvantaged. They had limited ammunition. Each man was meant to carry 100 rounds, but many had wasted theirs shooting at animals during the march. Watson pulled me back, warning that we could be spotted. He pointed toward the village, which was in chaos. Some warriors were rushing out to join the fighting, while others returned carrying the wounded or dead. A terrible cry echoed across the village, raised by the women and children. The sound grew to an unbearable pitch, only to subside before flaring up again as more casualties were brought in. I couldn't keep still and rose again. The firing was steady, so I took off my hat to stay less visible. What I saw was intense. Waves of warriors had forced a crossing and were pushing the soldiers back from the riverbank. The Indians rode in a circular formation, reloading and firing as they moved. The cavalry's line held firm, causing many of the attackers to fall. I saw riderless horses fleeing, while others collapsed in dust. But the soldiers were also falling. Their formation thinned, yet they stood their ground with bravery. These men earned $13 a month. The warriors, however, fought for their families, their homes, and their honor. Each side seemed intent on total destruction. The Indians kept up their relentless circling. When one of them was injured or killed, he was quickly carried away, with plenty more to take his place. But for the soldiers, there were no replacements. If wounded, no one came to help. If dying, no one closed their eyes. It was heartbreaking. The luckiest soldiers were those killed immediately, for if a Sioux captured a wounded enemy, he faced horrible torment. We were helpless to do anything. We knew what we should do, but were powerless to act. Wherever we looked, we saw hostile warriors. On foot, we had no chance against so many mounted fighters. While Custer battled the Sioux, dozens of Indians had taken up positions along the bluffs overlooking the area. Any movement from us would have exposed our location. Still, we decided not to stay in our hiding place for long. We began to consider how to reach our unit, where we knew we were needed. It turned out we'd made a mistake by following the wrong path. What we thought was a trail was actually one made by buffalo moving to and from the river. Neither Watson nor I had noticed the actual cavalry trail, which had headed toward the far end of the village. Instead, we had ended up at the river crossing near its center. The terrain was rocky and dry, making hoofprints nearly invisible. This error put us in a precarious spot. Looking back toward the battle, I saw the cavalry retreating toward a small hill, their numbers diminished. Gunfire was tapering off, but the Indians continued their circling charge, raising clouds of dust. Groups of warriors assigned to retrieve the dead and wounded kept coming into the village carrying their burdens. Despite their losses, the soldiers had clearly inflicted significant damage. Meanwhile, the noise in the village never ceased. Cries and wails from the women and children filled the air. Watson remained quiet and thoughtful during all this, then finally spoke. He believed the 7th Cavalry would be overwhelmed. He said we had seen twice as many warriors as there were soldiers. I couldn't accept that outcome, but Watson was sure. "They're going to lose," he said flatly. I still believed the cavalry could prevail. We planned to scale the riverbank, find the cavalry's trail, and try to rejoin our unit. But this turned out to be unwise. The nearby bluffs made it impossible to pass. Still determined, we left our cover and descended to the riverbank. I was parched and suggested we get some water. After drinking, I noticed 3 Indians on the bluff above us. We thought we could handle them and began climbing the bank, staying close to the cut. Halfway up, I spotted more Indians, 8 of them, watching us from the top. One stood up and gestured in a seemingly friendly way, but I knew it was a trap. I shouted for Watson to run, and we bolted, watching the warriors ready their rifles. I urged Watson to move faster, and he gradually pulled ahead. The shots rang out, but none hit us. One Indian mounted his horse and galloped along the bluff, waving a blanket and pointing in our direction. We knew we'd been spotted. We thought about returning to our earlier hiding spot, but with the enemy watching, it wasn't safe. So we passed it and reached the crossing again. The horse we'd seen earlier was gone, likely taken by the enemy. We ran across the ford and into thick underbrush. As we slowed down, Watson remained ahead of me. Then I heard hoofbeats behind. Turning, I saw a white man and what I assumed to be a Crow warrior. I called to Watson, thinking help had arrived. I turned to wait for them, but they stopped, swung their rifles over their saddles, and aimed at us. We were stunned. We had no choice but to run. The path ran through thick brush, and we rushed for its cover. They fired, missing as usual, but bullets tore through the foliage around us. We realized then that we were perhaps fated to survive the Indians. Though unharmed physically, we felt deeply shaken. We decided to ambush them if they followed us. We crept further into the brush, revolvers ready, rifles in hand, and waited. But they never came. Maybe they sensed our plan. We did, however, resolve to kill the white man if he returned, even if the warrior escaped. We had spent 2.5 hours hiding in the river bend, watching Custer's desperate fight. It had taken us half an hour to reach that spot. 3 hours in total had passed. By then, the shooting had died down. This phase of the conflict was over. You might wonder why we tried to rejoin our comrades after such a long delay. My answer is simple: a sense of duty and love for our fellow soldiers. Others might ask why we hadn't tried sooner, but we'd been forced back at the fort, cut off by warriors on the ridges, and had no mounts. When we did attempt it, it nearly cost us our lives. Now we didn't know which way to go. Indians surrounded us, and we knew any escape would be pure luck. The village still roared with noise, showing it remained in Indian hands. We stayed alert, though the brush made it hard to see much. I stood cautiously to scan the bluffs. No Indians in sight, which puzzled me. Then I looked toward the far end and saw a group of horsemen climbing the trail. I spotted several guidons waving in the wind, flags carried by our cavalry. I alerted Watson, but he was certain they were hostiles. I pointed out how orderly they moved and their military flags, suggesting we try to reach them. "All right," Watson said. We followed the trail until we cleared the brush, then began ascending the bluff to intercept the column. But we had barely begun before realizing we were in danger. Ahead, in a clearing filled with fallen cottonwoods stripped of bark, probably cut by the Indians for horse feed in deep snow, we saw another group of Indians near the river. To avoid them, we stayed hidden in the brush and moved quickly toward the bluff. Focused on avoiding those warriors, we failed to notice a second group until we heard their guttural voices. I ducked behind a fallen tree. I didn't know where Watson went. Peering over the log, I saw mounted warriors pointing toward the cavalry. Then they began moving toward my position. I feared they'd spotted me and crouched low, revolver ready. I resolved to save one bullet for myself, determined not to be taken alive. Every sense alert, I waited, but they passed me without noticing and headed to the river. I jumped up and ran. By now, the approaching cavalry had renewed my hope. Before long, I heard someone call my name. Watson was rushing toward me. His safety gave me new strength. We climbed the bluff, but I was losing stamina. Despite the Indians in view, I collapsed and begged Watson to go on. He refused. But the sight of a large group of Indians crossing the river pushed us into action. I struggled to my feet and kept moving. The heat felt unbearable, perhaps due to exhaustion. Watson said nothing. He, too, knew it wouldn't help. As we climbed halfway, the warriors opened fire. But we weren't worried. Their aim was poor under pressure. We were so worn out, we no longer feared them. The hill felt endless. I collapsed again, but then Watson pointed out the cavalry cresting the rise. Energized, we pressed on through a hail of bullets. The warriors didn't want to let us escape. We stepped onto the trail at the front of the advancing column around 5 p.m. The first familiar face we saw was Sergeant Knipe, who had been sent to retrieve ammunition. Reno's force then consisted of 6 left-wing companies and Company B of the right, led by Captain McDougal. Knipe told me my horse had been found and was with Fitzgerald, the farrier. "They all thought you were a goner," he added. This news lifted my spirits. Moments later, the retreat order came, and Reno's troops began withdrawing slowly. Though puzzled, we obeyed orders without question. I moved through the ranks to find my horse. Fitzgerald looked surprised. "Thought the Indians had your scalp," he said. I joked that I'd outrun them. My saddle was untouched. Our retreat didn't go far. Indians were closing in. Company D, led by Captain Weir, shielded our withdrawal. He had pleaded to ride to Custer's aid, but had been denied. Reno moved left into a broad ravine. The Indians now unleashed a deadly hail of gunfire. Our horses and mules, exhausted and starving, crowded together in panic. We had almost no protection, just gravel, sand, and sparse sagebrush. Ravines all around allowed the warriors to close in, which they did quickly. We unloaded hardtack boxes from the mules and used them as makeshift barricades, arranging them into a tight semicircle. When we finished preparing, the sun was setting. We believed the night would give us a break. Indians rarely attacked after dark, but new problems arose. The horses and mules were easy targets. This was painful for us cavalrymen. We loved our mounts. A tragic accident happened nearby. A cheerful soldier was chatting behind a box when a bullet struck him dead. He had placed the box incorrectly, leaving its edge exposed. We were shocked. Moments later, a bullet hit the box behind me, and I wondered if my end was near. But it stopped short. I was relieved that darkness had fallen. I wandered to the edge of the bluff to observe the village. By then, night had fully settled. I could see large fires burning. The noise had only increased. Deep male voices, wailing women, screaming children, barking dogs. It was a dreadful symphony, yet the villagers seemed to revel in it. Then, unexpectedly, a bugle rang out from the village. 2 more calls followed. Our officers ordered our buglers to respond, hoping for a reply. But only a long, mournful note answered. It wasn't what we'd hoped for. I returned to my dead horse, removed my gear, and lay down behind my cracker box for the night. As I drifted off, the cries of the warriors and the bugle's lament were the last things I heard. I slept deeply and was unaware of anything until I felt someone kicking my boots. I jumped up. It was Captain Benteen. Once I was fully awake, he said I needed to help at the head of the ravine, where the Indians were sneaking in. If they succeed, we're finished, he warned. The Indians had been firing volleys before I even woke and were still doing so. Under cover of night, they had moved into the ravines near us. It was nearly impossible to push them back. Some were so close, their fire was dangerously accurate. The constant whine of bullets and the cries of wounded horses were oppressive, but I knew what had to be done. My post lay uphill, near the edge of the bluff. As I readied my gear, I glanced toward it and wondered how I'd make it there alive. Bullets flew from every direction, tearing through the ground. Even our barricades offered little safety. The enemy seemed intent on wiping us out. I ran up the hill, instinctively drawing inward, fearing a bullet might hit my legs or feet. I wasn't alone in my rush toward the ravine's head. Captain Benteen was also assembling a group to advance in that direction, intending to hold back the Indians or perhaps push them back entirely. I quickly reached the summit of the bluff, where the village, the river, and the ravine's mouth came into view. I believed I would cross safely, but once inside the ravine, the Indians launched a sudden barrage, and I was struck. A bullet tore through my right hand and arm. From my elevated vantage point, I saw just 11 cavalrymen below, a small number to clear a ravine crowded with Indian fighters. Yet their resolve was firm. Captain Benteen approached and delivered a concise speech. "This is our only vulnerable spot," he said. "If the Indians break through, it's over for us." He asked if they were prepared, and when they responded affirmatively, he commanded them to rush in and expel the enemy. With cheers, they charged, revolvers in one hand, carbines in the other. Benteen himself veered to the left, seemingly unaware or indifferent to the bullets flying around him. Knowing I was no longer combat effective, I glanced around, hoping to find someone who could point me to a surgeon. I knew Custer had 2 with him, but I was uncertain if any were here. Nearby, a wounded soldier lay writhing in pain. As I contemplated getting up, a Sioux chief shouted an order, prompting a fresh volley of gunfire. My suffering neighbor let out a sharp cry before going quiet. Once the firing ceased, I was amazed to find myself unscathed. I struggled upright, but felt faint and disoriented from blood loss. Looking around, I saw the remnants of the brave charge down the ravine. Few made it back, but they had done their job. We had men among us who faced death without flinching. One young man, in particular, displayed extraordinary bravery. No matter the threat, he was ever ready at his station. I turned toward the horses and saw how they too suffered, starving and parched. But our condition was no better. I located a surgeon in the center of our defensive position, tending to the injured and dying. I asked him to look at my wound when possible. He wrapped it up and explained that the only real remedy would be frequent rinsing with water. An ironic suggestion, given we had no water. The river was unreachable, except by way of the ravine where 11 valiant men had fought earlier. But trying to get water that way would be nearly suicidal. I observed the doctor continue working, attending to new casualties. Some were beyond help, some would never fully heal, and I'd carry the damage to my hand forever. The sun glared off the sand and rocks, intensifying the heat. The combination of blood loss and dehydration overwhelmed me, and I collapsed. No one paid much attention. This was becoming commonplace. I still clung to my revolver and carbine. As I fell, I managed to turn over and place the carbine beneath me, suspecting someone might try to take it if they thought I was done for. I don't know how long I lay there, but at some point I felt someone rolling me over and taking my weapon. That stirred me enough to sit up, but the person and my gun were gone. He'd left his own, broken and useless, in its place. As I reflected bitterly on this act, I saw Captain Benteen gallop into our midst and force out several men hiding among the horses. "Clear out and do your part," he barked. Word spread quickly that the Indians were preparing to assault our lines. They had us nearly surrounded, and we could hear them speaking just beyond our perimeter. Sensing what was coming, Benteen organized every available man where he thought the attack would land. The heat was suffocating, and the Indian silence weighed heavily on us. We all understood how grim our situation was, yet the men's faces showed a fierce resolve not to go down cheaply. Only 2 spades remained, the rest were lost or broken, and no natural cover was available. Very few moments in history mirror what we were enduring. The Civil War's hardships were severe, but fighting Indians was an even grimmer affair. A white soldier might take prisoners, but Indians spared no one. Once captured, your fate was sealed. What troubled us most was how to move our wounded. Many were seriously hurt. Everywhere you looked, soldiers lay dead or injured, and the worst was yet to come. The sudden shout of an Indian leader broke the quiet, followed by a massive volley. Dozens of our mules and horses were cut down. Still, our men stayed low and fired sparingly, only when a clear shot presented itself. Though we were vastly outnumbered, the Indians lacked the fiery drive they'd shown against Custer the previous day. They had likely learned a hard lesson. Were it not for our vigilance, they might have overwhelmed us. But wherever they attacked, we were ready. At the height of the fighting, just as things seemed bleakest, our doctor dropped his tools, grabbed a weapon, and moved toward the front. Several urged him not to go. If anything happened to him, our chances would worsen. As if to support their plea, a new wounded soldier was brought in requiring immediate care. That convinced him, at least temporarily, to resume his medical duties. He remained busy for some time. I slowly moved about within our cramped position and was heartened to see some men setting up canvas over the wounded. Officers had brought the canvas for their own comfort, but now used it to protect the helpless. The canvas had to be stretched low, held up by whatever sticks we could find. Firewood was useless to us anyway. We had no water to cook with. The wounded were deprived of the simplest comforts. As I wandered, I was struck by the hopelessness of our plight. We didn't have days, only hours. We could perhaps bury the fallen, but we had no way to dispose of dead horses and mules. The stench would soon become unbearable, and yet we had nowhere else to go. Moving the wounded was impossible. While many of us wanted to relocate, several reasons held us back. We were split from our main force and lacked leadership. The Indians seemed bent on wiping us out completely. Our only realistic shot was to attempt something under the cover of night. I wondered if any other men from Company C had suffered a fate like mine. Although Company C had fought with Custer, a few had stayed back with the pack train. I began searching for familiar faces. I first came upon a man named Bennett, someone I held in high regard. He clearly didn't have long. Kneeling beside him, I asked if I could help in any way. "Water, Thompson, please, for God's sake," he whispered. His voice, once strong, was now barely audible. I promised I'd try if I survived. He let go of my hand, seemingly at peace. I then understood what that promise truly meant. It was June 26th, a date forever etched into our memories. Getting water would be a serious ordeal. All paths to the river were blocked by the enemy. Still, I made up my mind and began looking for a canteen. I recalled the ravine those 11 brave men had cleared and figured it was my best shot. After speaking with some loitering among the horses, I concluded the ravine was the only option. I quickly gathered 2 canteens and a kettle. I made my way to the ravine's upper end, which descended to the river. Not much had changed since the morning clash. The Indian gunfire had quieted somewhat, letting me move with slightly less tension. Still, I didn't know how long that would last. As I reached a rise in the ground, I noticed several men inspecting something nearby. It was an Indian warrior dressed in full war gear, part of what lent them such a menacing appearance. He had died alarmingly close to our lines, a reminder of how little space we had. The sheer number of Indians allowed them to fill every natural position. Under different circumstances, the view of the snow-covered Bighorn Mountains would have been breathtaking. As I debated my next move, a comrade questioned me. "Where are you off to, and what do you plan to do?" I had expected support, but instead he tried to dissuade me and reported my intent to Sergeant Knipe. The sergeant warned me that the task was essentially suicidal. I explained that I couldn't fight, but could still serve by helping the wounded. They saw I was set on going and dropped the matter. Tim Jordan, also from Company C, gave me a large handkerchief to make a sling for my injured arm. I began down the ravine, then paused. I had forgotten my pistol belt, which I'd loaned to someone. He appeared confused and claimed to have misplaced it. I resigned myself to going without it and threaded my way through some civilian packers nearby. They likely thought that tagging along with us was the safest form of patriotism. The deeper I went, the narrower and more haunting the ravine became. It was clear the Indians had tried breaking through here, hoof marks everywhere, but now it was eerily empty. Eventually I came to a bend. Peering around cautiously, I spotted the Little Horn River and a thick stand of cottonwood trees on the far bank. It was possible Indians were hidden there, waiting. But no movement was visible, so I pressed forward. The bank was muddy and soft. I feared becoming mired, but decided to risk it. I laid down the canteens, grabbed the kettle with my good hand, and made several bounding leaps to the river's edge. The water was shallow and flowed over a sandy patch. With a wide scoop upstream, I managed to collect mostly sand and a bit of water. As I moved back toward the ravine's mouth, a burst of gunfire rang out, bullets slamming into the bank behind me. Luckily, I reached cover unharmed. I wasn't sure if they would pursue me. Armed, I might have felt more secure. Wanting to move faster, I considered ditching the kettle. Instead, I set it between my knees and poured the water into the canteens. Glancing behind me, I checked for signs of pursuit, but saw none. Though parched, I refused to drink before reaching my companions. I offered a canteen to several men in Company C, but they declined, understanding it was meant for the more severely wounded. Reaching Bennett, I placed the canteen in his hands, but he lacked the strength to lift it. Private John J. Mahoney was with him, and I trusted he'd provide whatever assistance was needed. Continuing on, I found 2 others from our company with lesser wounds. I gave them the remaining canteen, instructing them to share it with others if they didn't finish it themselves, which they did. One trumpeter, David McVeigh, seemed reluctant to pass it on. I pulled it from his grasp and handed it to the next soldier. Enraged, he drew his revolver and aimed it at me, threatening to shoot if I didn't leave at once. I was too shocked to speak at first. Regaining composure, I argued my case. Words were all I had. In truth, I was fortunate to be unarmed. Had I possessed a weapon, I might have done something regrettable, though it would have been an act of survival. Meanwhile, desperate cries for water echoed all around. "One drink! $10!" cried one man. "15 for a full canteen," another shouted. "$20?" came yet another voice. The bidding war resembled an auction. Witnessing this only strengthened my resolve to make another trip to the river, carrying more canteens to avoid repeated risk. The Indians kept up sporadic firing, while we returned shots only when a target was clear. My next trip was made with greater confidence. As I neared the bend, I paused to scan the terrain, and was startled to see a soldier seated on a dirt mound, facing the water, unaware of my approach. Curious, I went to see who it was. He had 2 camp kettles riddled with holes and held his weapon at the ready, watching the trees across the river for threats. Closer inspection revealed a pool of blood near him, from a leg wound. He was clearly immobile. I asked how he'd been hurt. He explained he'd been fetching water when a volley struck him, shattering his leg and damaging his kettles. Despite the pain, he dragged himself to his current position. I told him it was now my turn. Though he warned me not to go, I remained firm. I wasn't coming back empty-handed. I set down my canteens and retrieved my kettle from earlier. I carefully watched the opposite trees as I advanced, but no one was in sight. Choosing the deepest part of the river, I leapt forward, splashing into the water. I knew stealth was pointless, so I relied on my speed. A volley followed, but I emerged unharmed. Madden, the wounded man I'd just left, watched from a distance. When I returned, I offered him a drink. To my surprise, he declined, saying he wasn't thirsty. Strange, considering how much blood he'd lost. Thank you for watching today's episode on Empire History Central. Stay with us by liking and subscribing to our channel for more detailed history deep discoveries. What's your thought on Custer's last stand? Do you think he wanted the glory all to himself, or was he a tactical genius? Tell us what you think in the comment section. See you next time. Bye.